Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Most Canadians underestimate just how fragile our economic advantage is, and politicians, well, they keep missing the real opportunities to turn things around. This week's spring economic update from the Carney government in Ottawa was no exception. Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. I'm Brian Lilly, your host.
More cost, more debt, more taxes, more on the national credit card, and more interest payments for Canadians. So once again, with Canadians spending $3,000 per family on interest for the debt, is there any limit on the Liberal credit card?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in the face of a tariff war, in the face of an actual war, this government has reduced the deficit by $11 billion. This government!
Well, that's not exactly true. We'll get into that. The big question, though, is there really a difference? Have things changed from the old government? That's part of what we're going to discuss in this episode of Full Comment as we welcome back Professor Ian Lee from the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University in Ottawa, and Carlo Dade. He is Director of International Policy and the New North America Initiative at the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy. So, gentlemen, let me start with you. We'll start with Ian. Quick thoughts, and I mean quick, Ian. I know how you talk. Quick thoughts on the fiscal update. Did it deliver for Canada, or was it, like I said in my column, not much there?
Brian, I agree with you. There wasn't much there. To do the one hand this on the one hand that, it was, I believe, empirically, much better than any of the budgets of the last 10 years under the previous government. So let's acknowledge that. Maybe a low bar.
In what way?
Well, the former government, in a book I'm now doing with Larry O'Brien on the outlook on the economy, took the economy backward. Our GDP per capita went down. Our productivity went down. Many of the economic fundamentals have declined in this country using stats, CAN data, Bank of Canada data. So that is, irrefutable. And then they had policies that were so hostile to the development of of natural resources in this country, the No Pipeline Bill, the Tanker Ban Bill, and so forth. So what Carney has been reversing many of those policies, but I thought he had a wonderful chance to take it to the next level, and he didn't. I thought that it was a stand pat, stand still budget. They didn't go to the next level, which they have to do to overcome the economic damage of the past 10 years.
Carlo, your quick thoughts on the fiscal update. Look, I want to keep trying to cheer on this government. They're in charge, whether I want them to be or not, and I want the country to succeed. But I felt like this was, just like the budget last November, a missed opportunity to take moves to kickstart the economy.
Yeah, no, it was great news. Just imagine how infinitesimally greater it would have been if we had another pipeline. Look, where we have built the expansion of Trans Mountain, where we have built, we have seen rewards. This should be the chance to hammer that case. I think Canadians realize the dire financial situation. Everyone, I think, in air quotes, was worried about the deficit. And this was an object lesson in the need to build the infrastructure to earn the money that Canadians want to spend on other things. So look, from the West, it was, the missed opportunity was the object lesson in the need to build the infrastructure to move products to market.
I love that term, the luxury of complacency, because it sums up so much of kind of the feeling that we have in Canada. So, well, no, things are fine. Things are good. This is all just because of Donald Trump. If it wasn't for Donald Trump, we'd be doing great. I'm sorry, but you look at the economic growth over the last few years, and the budget did brag, Carlo, about how we're going to be the second fastest growing economy in the G7, according to the IMF, at 1.5%. That is not an economy on fire. I I have to ask both of you gentlemen, though, this fiscal update, just like the budget last fall, I was expecting more. You listen to the rhetoric of the government and how they've positioned themselves, and you think, okay, this is a group that wants to move fast, that wants to do things differently, and I'm having trouble seeing what they're doing differently than the old government, other than you've got a nice new guy from Central Casting, who's a central banker, who is at the front of it. Ian, uh, are you seeing in significant ways a departure from the former Trudeau government?
If you had asked me 90 days ago, I would have said yes. His announcements were reversing a significant number of the Trudeau government policies on energy, on carbon tax and the MOU with the Premier of Alberta and so forth. What sandbagged me and caught me off guard, because I thought he was going to go in a different direction as a blue liberal. What caught me off guard was his announcement, and I'm going to focus. We'll probably talk more about it, but this sovereign sovereign investment fund, which is not a real sovereign investment fund. It's
There's a
just
slip of the tongue, sovereign welfare fund.
Yes, that was a Freudian slip. Why I think we're now seeing a regress. My criticism for years has been that we've made a mistake for 60 years with what John Ibbotson called the Laurentian elites. And I'll say it very succinctly, and why I thought Carney was reversing it, but he isn't. That the Laurentian elites believed in the superior efficacy of state central planning. The French call it dirigisme, and he thought that was their belief, that their view was government planning was superior to market forces. And so they did all their, the national energy program and that kind of thing for the last 60 years. Carney said a fundamental rupture, and we've got to do things very differently. And he started down that road. And then in this announcement of this fund showed that they have not learned their lessons. And the lesson is, we don't have a shortage of capital in Canada. Capital is mobile around the world. It seeks out the best returns at obviously least cost and least barriers to entry. And why we've seen so much capital flight to the States is simply because they're better investment opportunities. And so, things like the No Pipeline Bill, the Tanker Ban Bill, the incredible red tape that's been documented by both the OECD and their analysis of the OECD countries, we're near the bottom, as well as the World Bank separate study on red tape and regulation. We're at the bottom. I thought he was going to strip that, or start that, to go down that road to strip it aside. What he's done is he's really gone to the status quo ante of the last 60 years, including the peak period under Trudeau, which is where the state is going to allocate capital. The state is going to make the decisions to make battery plants or subsidize Bombardier to take on, Airbus and Boeing. That's a failure. We have 60 years of failure of that belief that the state has superior strategic decision-making capacity. I thought Carney, coming out of Goldman Sachs and being a central banker and an economist, was going to say, not the way to go, but he didn't. And that's why I think this is not he's not taking the country in a new direction.
All right, so Carlo, since Ian raised the issue of the sovereign debt fund, because we're borrowing all the money that's going into it. This is not a sovereign wealth fund in the way the Norwegians have. We have to borrow every penny of it. It's I look at what we have already, and I know that Prime Minister Carney was asked about how is this different from the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and he said, well, that focuses on loans. And then you go to the Canada Infrastructure Bank website and you find out that no, they take equity stakes. And you look at the Canada Growth Fund, and uh, the Canada Strong Fund, the new one, is 25 billion. The Canada Infrastructure Bank is 45 billion, and they take equity stakes in companies. The Canada Growth Fund takes equity stakes in companies and is there also to try and encourage private sector investment. The Strategic Innovation Fund is also there to try and encourage all of this other investment. How many funds do we need, Carlo, to try and encourage private sector investment?
You don't need funds, as Ian's pointed out. You need to fix the fundamentals. Money is fleeing Canada to the US because there's a better return. So unless
But
you have a
hold on. The Carney government tells us that we've got the best foreign direct investment ever.
BS.
Yes.
But look, no, you do have, they're not on the phone with folks in the States, and they're trying to get money to Canada, and no one's buying. The issues are the fundamentals. Are you going to get a return on your investment? Where is the highest return? Where is the lowest risk? I would, though, just briefly on the Carney and, action meeting words, I still give him some runway. The fact that he's continuing to say largely the right things on building is encouraging, but we're running out of runway. Um, so he's got, I don't know how much more runway he has left, but he's got to start delivering. The flip side to that is it's hard. If it was simple, we would have already done it. But the reasons we haven't aren't just the Trudeau government. Turn the mirror back on the country. Turn the mirror on to the lower mainland in BC. Turn the mirror on to communities across the country. Turn the mirror on to Quebec. We have been our own worst enemy. And the governments may be aided and abetted with the worst tendencies apart, but it's also us. It's also, we've been yelling about this in Alberta. Had we had the ability to get pipelines, we wouldn't be as dependent on the U.S., but that's also a self-inflicted wound, and that I worry about that going forward. Um,
Okay, so Carlo, if I can ask you to just back up a little bit and explain how have we been our own worst enemy? Because there's an awful lot of Canadians who don't see that. They just see Donald Trump is bad. Okay, I can accept that. The Americans are attacking us. Okay, I can accept that. And they're to blame for everything. That's not accurate. So how are we at times our own worst enemies? Because too many Canadians will not understand that.
sure. And those are the Canadians who, with us out west, have been yelling and screaming. We is the collective of the country. So we have elections, and the results of those elections have consequences. At the end of the day, you can go riding by riding and put people on one side or the other. But really, what matters in terms of the international perception in how we function is the end result. So I would argue there are folks that are upset about this, but at the end of the day, the collective we um, has, when you look at the results of the election, wound up where we are. I would also argue that I don't know that folks who are suddenly aware of this or suddenly becoming vocal about it were as vocal as they needed to be early on. And so I was just in Speedy Creek, Swift Current over the winter, talking to
It's
the only
Brad Wall from Speedy Creek. He's a first-time caller. I'm making a joke about how we used to call into the local radio station there. He'd call himself Brad from Speedy Creek.
Brad is actually outside. He's down by Cypress Hills, but that's beside the point.
Now he is, yes.
The point is, I was talking to them and I said, look, with the issues on trade infrastructure and moving grain to market, when you hand out paychecks or envelopes, do you have a flyer in there informing the workers at the terminal how important this is, and to raise that message every time an MP comes home, to take a stand? Those who have wanted to prevent us from building have been very active. My history in international development, working with NGOs and foundations, these folks will go to the front line. I don't disagree that there's been opposition and folks complaining in Canada, but I don't know that the industries, I'm just speaking at crop life, I don't know that agriculture has been organized. They're too busy fighting amongst themselves to fight against the real threats, those who prevent us from building things. So I think the weakness is twofold. It's one, the majority, I guess, or the minority that was able to form a government in the past, but also those of us who are committed not doing enough. And I would argue that the fact that we are where we are is a condemnation. And I'm looking at myself here. I'm as much work as I've done arguing, raising the case, doing the research on the National Trade Infrastructure Plan, trying to figure out how to communicate. I didn't do enough. I wasn't successful in getting the message across. So the results are what they are. We are where we are because of what we've done and what we haven't done.
Brian, can I follow up on that? Because I want to add to this to answer your question and add to what Carlo said. I agree with everything you said. You said, well, how can we be our own Western man? What have we done? Well, let me give you Exhibit A. We have interprovincial tariffs in a very recent monograph. I think it was Trevor Tome, from Calgary, but it was an economist, converted all of the interprovincial trade barriers using some sophisticated economics, converted it into the equivalent of a percentage of tariff. Quebec, 25%, the effect of the interprovincial trade barriers in Quebec are 25% tariff against the rest of Canada. You looked at Ontario and the other provinces, they're between 15 and 20%. The American tariffs are 6%. So we're screaming at Donald Trump, and yet the provinces are charging 3 and 4 times what Donald Trump's charging us. That's just Exhibit A. Exhibit B. RBC Thought Leadership has a graph where they computed and compared us to the OECD. We have the highest corporate income taxes in the OECD. Finance Minister Flaherty, some years ago, talked about a tax advantage where he said, I want to keep our taxes just a little bit below the Americans so we don't incentivize our companies to go to the States. I've been arguing, and I get some progressives very angry, what we've done is put a great big bullseye on ourselves to our own investor class and business class in our country. Go to America. We are exploiting the hell out of you with the highest corporate income taxes in the wealthiest, most successful countries in the world. Go away. Third one. For the demonization of resources, which Trevor Tome and before him Stephen Gordon at Laval University and other economists showed had the highest productivity over the last 30, 40 years. The resource sector, as Stephen Gordon showed in the 90s, was responsible for almost all of our increase in our prosperity and our standard of living. So what did we do over these many last years? We went out of our way to try and inhibit and put barriers and penalties on the development of resources. The Ring of Fire has been talking for 35 years to build a road, and we haven't built the road. Mining, we are the worst on planet Earth from developing a mine from scratch. It takes 21 years in Canada, the worst in the world. So there's many things that we've done.
Why is that a problem? Why shouldn't it take 21
Because
years
it drives
to build a
down
mine?
GDP per capita, it drives investment out of the country to the United States, and it's reducing our standard of living. I call it, and to be colorful, I've called it in my classes for years, the Argentinization of Canada.
Ouch, 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 ouch. From a Latin Americanist, that's ouch. But let me just jump in quickly.
Okay,
what has
but
the
if I can
government done?
hold on, Carlo, hold on. Here's what I've got in front of me, because I was just writing about this today,
Yeah.
is that Canada's combined corporate tax rate comparisons, all right? We are at a combined federal, provincial, territorial rate of about 26.5%. That is just below the G7 average of 28.6, but above the OECD average of 24.2. Like that's not overly competitive. And I would say that going back to the time of Laurier, if not before, part of Canada's industrial policy was have a tax rate that is more competitive than our neighbors and the others. And so just so that people know, the U.S., which has cut taxes, their combined federal and state tax on average, and it depends on which state you end up in, is about 25.5%. So we're a full percentage point above on average. And, if you're going to Alberta, if you're going to Ontario versus Ohio or Florida or Tennessee, whatever, it will all change. But on average, we're now higher than the Americans. That's not a good spot for us to be in, Carlo.
It's worse than that. It's one thing to have high taxes and get services that make you more competitive. If taxes are an investment that create a climate that provides services to business or that give you an advantage, we're paying higher money and getting worse quality. So it's worse than, I think, just the high rates. The Nordics can have high taxes, but I don't think many people would argue that folks aren't getting decent health care, pensions. and other services. So it's worse, I think, than just paying high taxes. I don't mind paying high taxes if I walk into a health clinic and I'm treated right away, if I get the streets are clean,
Hold
if
on.
I have a
What did you say?
competitive
You're
business
treated?
environment.
You're treated right away? What is this you speak of?
It's called being an American and having tons of money and walking into your private doctor's office. But if I'm
Yeah.
paying that sort of money, I want that sort of service. But very quickly, on the government, you said, what has the government done? Here's one thing that they have done. Interprovincial trade barriers are important. The cost, as Trevor Tombe and others have pointed out, is high. It's aggregated, or it's disaggregated. People don't know this. But here's the point. We've cut provincial trade barriers and then turned around and said, well, there you go. Barriers are cut. Now, you, small company in Lethbridge, there are opportunities all across Canada. Forget about Mizzaloo, Bozeman, and Boise. We've got opportunities here in Canada and places in Canada you've never visited. Trois-Rivières, Trois-Pistoles, you can't tell the difference between the two, but trust us, there are opportunities out there. What the federal government announced this week, or no, late last week, was the creation of an internal trade commissioner service. So the company in Lethbridge that trades across the border but has no idea what's in Newfoundland or what's available in Ontario will now have assistance in finding those opportunities. When we cut trade barriers with Honduras, we don't say, okay, job's done, the market's down there, hit Mexico, keep going, and you'll find tons of opportunities. We have an analogous situation in Canada, and I've argued for over 10 years that we've needed this internal trade commissioner service. Quebec has an internal trade commissioner service. So the company in Lethbridge that has no idea how to find opportunities in Quebec, the Quebec company calls the Quebec Trade Office in Calgary, and they can find opportunities. So the federal government has come around to this realization that cutting barriers only helps companies that are already trading. Companies that have lost business in the U.S. and are desperately seeking alternatives are going to need help to find foreign markets, which could be Newfoundland. It could be Manitoba. It could be Quebec. So that's one thing that they've done. That's concrete, that's real, that's learning a lesson from the past. So tip of the hat for them for only taking 10 years to come around to that idea.
I'll admit that that's a good idea. And at that point, I'm going to take a pause. We'll have some ad breaks, pay some bills. And when we come back, we'll talk about other things that could be happening beyond the trade scope to try and boost Canada's economy. Back in moments.
There were so many missed opportunities to catch this before the devastating thing happened.
A third of them we found literally in the phone book. These people were not afraid. They knew that nobody was effectively hunting them. They knew they had escaped justice, that they were going to die in their beds.
When I give talks at law schools, is that the charter ultimately is empowering a minority, and it's empowering a minority that's a guild across the country. And it's a fairly elite guild, and the guild is lawyers.
Families who were split by referendum and brothers and sisters who never talked to each other for years after the referendum because they were so angry at each other because of the emotions on both sides.
The reason he was assassinated was not because he was trying to put a satellite into space, but because the gun that he was creating had other applications that made him and the gun very dangerous.
It's finally here. A new season of Canada Did What? Host Media podcast that revisits the big Canadian political events you might think you remember and tells you the real story you never knew. I'm Tristan Hopper. The voices you just heard are from our brand new Season 2. We will unpack some of the pivotal moments that helped define our country, often without a vote, usually without a plan, and sometimes without anyone admitting what they'd done. We'll find out how Canada became a welcoming paradise for untold numbers of Nazi war criminals after the Second World War. We let them build monuments to their wartime exploits and even ended up honoring a Nazi fighter in the House of Commons. And I'm sorry to say that none of that happened by accident. We'll bring you the little-known story of a troubled Canadian rocket scientist who turned to a sinister life of selling giant guns to terrible people. And if that sounds like a spy novel, it ends like one too. You'll hear the behind-the-scenes story of Quebec's attempted secession from Canada and how very close we came to a political crisis that would have made Brexit look like a picnic. You'll hear about how the much-celebrated Charter of Rights and Freedoms turned into something its creators never wanted, and how many of the most extravagant warnings about the document were all quickly proven true. And you'll even hear about how authorities bungled multiple chances to stop the deadliest terrorist attack in our country's history and then proceeded to pretend it never happened. These aren't dusty history lessons. They're stories about power, ambition, madness, and the things about Canada that a lot of people would rather ignore. But not you. You won't want to miss an episode. Subscribe to make sure you get all of Season 2 starting March 2026 anywhere you get your podcasts.
So above and beyond trying to figure out what to do with sovereign wealth funds, what to do with taxes, how do we actually boost the Canadian economy? I had both of you gentlemen on the Full Comment podcast about 15 months ago, shortly after Donald Trump's inauguration, where I watched his inaugural speech, and he not only talked about tariffs, my favorite word, but also was talking about all the other things he was going to do to the American economy. And I thought, oh, wow, we're in for a world of hurt if we don't move. Have we done enough within Canada? And we were talking about this a little bit just before the break, Carlo, on the, as you were describing the internal trade side. Have we done enough in terms of tax reform, cutting back on red tape, reforming things like immigration, which has led to a horrible situation where it's just Justin Trudeau said we're bringing in people faster than we could absorb them. On terms of corporate welfare, have we done enough to reform our own internal systems to make things work? Ian?
I'm glad I got a chance to kick in on this because I have a pet peeve of mine that I've been talking about most of my adult life, and that's writ large what I call protectionism. I mean, interprovincial trade barriers are a form of internal protectionism, but I'm now talking about our external protectionism. Let's put right up at the top supply management. Okay, it's only a small amount, but it's symbolic of our larger problems. The bigger one, for example, is the Telecom Act, where the Parliament expressly states no foreign cell phone telecom can come to Canada. And as a consequence, we have some of the highest cell phone fees on planet Earth. This is straight out of, Adam Smith and Economics 101. When you reduce competition by keeping out foreign competition, what you do is you reduce the incentive to innovate. Schumpeter taught us. You innovate because you're terrified of getting clobbered and killed and put into bankruptcy by your competitor. So you innovate to differentiate yourself, to become provide something unique, and that allows you to succeed and compete. What we've done, we have many, many protected industries in Canada, oligopolistic, where 2 or 3 or 4 firms control 60, 70, 80% of the output. And so no wonder our productivity has been going down. And Carolyn Rogers at the Bank of Canada, the deputy governor, has talked about this. We are not as competitive. Our productivity is going down because we have deliberately created the opportunities for multiple oligopolistic, very low competition industries to emerge. And so they don't compete because they don't have to. There's no conspiracy here. It's just if you don't have to compete, you won't. Adam Smith taught us that 250 years ago. And so we've got to open up the economy.
I visited his gravesite in, is he buried in Edinburgh? I believe so. But so there's 2 things. Supply management is one thing. And the telecom thing that you talked about is another. Let's deal with the supply management side first, because this is highly political, even more so than telecom. And we keep seeing in media report after media report, well, the Americans want to take over our dairy industry and they want to get rid of supply management. And then you talk to American trade negotiators, you talk to Ambassador P. Hoekstra, you talk to members of Congress, of the Senate, and they're like, no, we don't want to get rid of supply management. We have our own subsidy system. We just want you guys to stop being jerks when it comes to the agreement that we signed in 2018. That's a world of difference, isn't it, Carlo?
Yeah, no, the Americans don't want to destroy supply management. They want a bigger cut of the racket. They look on Canada, were we to truly reform and force liberalization and efficiency gains, we'd be a competitor for them. They'd have a whole nother problem.
Oh,
As it
like,
is now, they have
all the dairy farms would be in Alberta and Saskatchewan and would make Wisconsin look like, a piker, right? Like, we would be selling them all kinds of milk and butter and cheese, and they'd be hating us. If it
yeah,
was fully free market, that's what would happen. But
and
that
it's
would annoy Quebec.
And instead, they have a protected market in Canada where they can elbow us to get a bigger slice, a bigger taste of the action, as they say in the mob. It's like a mobster coming in, you've got a racket going. They're not going to put you out of business. They're going to take a bigger cut. So that's the way the
But, I
Americans.
mean, we are our own mob with,
Yes, yes,
supply
yes, absolutely.
management. We negotiated with them.
Absolutely. And a bigger mobster has come in and said, I want a cut of
So,
the
but
racket
we
that you got.
negotiated with them that they would have whatever percentage it was, whatever amount they could export to us, and we said, "Yeah, okay, yeah, you can have that, and here's your quota." And then we turned around and we gave that quota to Agripur, Saputo, Armstrong, and all the Canadian suppliers. So the Americans can't even export to us if they want. They've got to wait for their competitors in Canada to say, "Yeah, we want some of your cheaper stuff."
And because the SM5 did this, the Americans are now going to come back and say, not only do you have to honor the previous agreement, but we want a bigger cut. You pissed us off, and now we want more. So that, I think, was always a potential on the table, but that is certainly going to happen going forward. Our own worst enemy.
Well,
We did this
I
to
talk
ourselves.
every other industry I talk to, Ian, says the dairy cartel in Canada could kill the entire CUSMA agreement and mess us all up.
This is why I could, at the end of the day, there's 8,500 dairy farmers, mostly in Quebec and Eastern Ontario. More in Quebec than Eastern Ontario, but let's not quibble. Whether it's 60-40, who cares? It's a small number, but it's extremely symbolic. I mean, Donald Trump talks about it endlessly. The Americans have been talking about it. If you go and look at the USTR trade report tabled in Congress every year, it's a public document. They've been listing that at the top of the list since the Clinton administration. That's a third of a century ago. And so we should, if we want a CUSMA agreement, and I think it's absolutely essential, because if it is revoked or canceled, you watch the Canadian dollar crash and you watch more business exits to the United States. It's going to hollow out Canada. And so we should look at that USTR report and say, look at the 4 or 5 or 6 top irritants, the digital services tax, the Telecom Act, the supply management. We should be looking at that instead of saying, as many Canadians are, we're not going to give up an inch to that Donald Trump. We should see this as an opportunity to open up our own economy, which will benefit us and stop us from exploiting ourselves, which is what protectionism does, because the protected industries raise the prices to Canadians to charge us more because they can get away with it because of lack of competition. So what we should be doing in the CUSMA negotiations is saying, hell, man, we'll give you that. We'll give you supply management. We don't want it. We'll open up the telecom. We'll open up airlines. But in exchange, this is what we want. We want complete open access, tariff-free to the United States across the board. And this is an opportunity, but we're seeing it. A lot of pundits and politicians are seeing the giving up of these. They're saying, oh my goodness, don't do that. It'll show we're weak to Donald Trump. So we're trying to keep these industries that are exploiting the hell out of us. We're trying to keep their exploitation racket in place. I mean, this is upside down, backward, and nuts.
I find myself reaching for my copy of Robert Lighthouser's book, No Trade is Free, because he would disagree with you, and that's the kind of the sense or the the area that Jameson Greer, the new U.S. trade representative, is in. Look, we don't have to give up all of supply management. We just have to honor the past agreement. And I think that would work. If we gave up all of supply management, then Carlo would retire from the University of Calgary and become a dairy farmer somewhere between Calgary and Lethbridge and be making out like a bandit. Let me ask you both about this. So the telecom bit, I've been looking at this for a long time, and I don't love that you've got 3 or 4 companies that control all of it either. But when you look at what, say, T&T Mobile or T-Mobile or AT&T or any of the big companies in the States, Verizon, what do they want to do? They just want to come in and compete in Toronto, Vancouver. Maybe if they're bold, they want to go to Montreal because it's a big market, but then they've got to become bilingual. But they don't want to do everything else. And the argument from the Canadian telcos, which has some merit, I'm not going to say all merit, but some merit, is they are constantly being pushed of, why don't you have service in this far remote region of my province? And, it's somewhere where there's no money to be made. That's why they don't have cell service there. And yet, for them to be able to sell in these major markets, they're told you must provide the cell service there. So how do you balance that out between allowing the American companies in, but also telling the Canadian companies to sell in Toronto, in Vancouver, in Montreal, in Calgary? You've got to provide service in who knows where.
I went back to school in '82 after 9 years in banking, and this was just when the whole deregulation of airlines broke out. And it was ferocious and it was fierce. And all the small towns and all the politicians said, we're going to be doomed because they won't fly into the little tiny towns anymore. We're going to lose our air service and we're going to die. And they trotted this out endlessly, ad nauseum. They still pushed it through. And what happened? Well, they segmented and rationalized the market. So yes, the little towns and villages stopped getting jets flying in. They got little putt-putt propeller airplanes. So what? In other words, they rationalized the market and said, we'll put big planes flying into big hub airports, Toronto, Chicago and LA and that, and we'll put medium-sized planes for the medium-sized airports and so on. They did not lose their service. The market grew 3, 4, 5-fold over the next 20 years. This is one of the canards I read all the time, that if you allow the foreigners in, we are going to lose, the market will shrink. And that is not the evidence in every market that's been opened up.
Hold on, Ian. Hold on. That is not the argument that I'm making. The argument that I'm making is that we have a regulator called the CRTC, an organization that I would love to dismantle tomorrow, brick by brick, and I would happily do it by hand. They tell them that if you want to sell across the country, you've got to go to these small markets. That is not what the Verizons and the T-Mobiles and the AT&Ts want to do if they come to Canada. So if we let them in, do we also tell them that you've got to supply cell service to Flin Flon and Larange and,
Brian,
a tiny town in northern Alberta that I was in last
That's an undocumented assumption. I have traveled across the United States over my lifetime and road trips to 44 or 50 states. Okay, I have. Trust me. And I can go into little podunk places, rural Texas, rural South Carolina. I've been there, okay? Rural Ohio. And they have cell phone service. I go to upstate New York. It's only an hour from my city in Ottawa. And I'm telling you, they have excellent cell along Highway 37, hugging the St. Lawrence. So this is one of these urban legends, that, the people out in the rural, they're not going to get any service, and it's not accurate. That cell phone companies, first off, they've gone digital completely, and they're going more and more wireless, and they're going more and more satellite based. And so I'm not worried about that. And they are getting excellent service in these rural and remote communities in the U.S. and increasingly in Canada, because we've been rolling out the broadband strategy, which is extending that service with government subsidies to rural, remote, northern communities and rural communities. So again, I think this is a canard to justify keeping their protected market so they can charge some of the highest cell phone fees in the world.
So I would disagree with that. We are a lot more dispersed than are the Americans with lower population density. The government does have an obligation to assure that service does reach communities. I think the dynamics of the U.S. market are different than the dynamics of the American market. You can spread those costs more easily amongst larger populations in the U.S. It would be more difficult in Canada. And in the States, you have special provisions on getting cell phone service to First Nations, to reserves, to places where there's low density and low incomes. So the Americans have dealt with this. Look, I think it's not a question of whether or not we require them. It's a question of whether or not the requirement is intended to serve the Canadian public interest or whether it's intended to serve the interest of the cell phone providers. And I think as long as we have a policy that balances the interest between the two, it's workable. I would agree that I don't know that we've had that balance in terms of letting the Americans in versus keeping them out. Um, but I wanted to get back to the comments about the trade agreement.
If I can just pause here for a second, Carlo, my concern would be that the CRTC, as much as Ian wants to look towards Adam Smith and being purist on this, and I get that, Ian, really do, is that the CRTC is a horrible organization that cannot regulate telecom, it cannot regulate broadcast, and now it's being put in charge of the internet with a website that looks like it was designed in the Netscape Navigator era. And these guys would not find those fine dividing lines that you're seeing. They would just say, no, you must do this or you must do that. By the way, the small town in northern Alberta I was in last summer was Provost, and then a ball tournament in Macklin, Saskatchewan. Try and get cell service up there. Actually, you can. And they also have a subway. It's good. All right. So, Carlo, your thoughts on the trade agreement?
So you made the point that if we lose the agreement, um, we'll see jobs flee, we'll see the Canadian economy tank. We're undertaking a project as part of this new North America initiative to bring trade economists together to actually run the scenarios for the review of the North American trade agreement. No agreement, two bilateral agreements, 10% across the board tariff, which is what I think we'll get, two separate agreements, a zombie agreement, etc. And we want to not just come up with the scenarios, but quantify, model the impacts. What we've seen with the Bank of Canada announcement in their modeling and what we're seeing from some of the private banks is a quantification of what the damage would be. And we're seeing things range from 1.4 to 2% hit in GDP for 1 year. As a country, we could survive that, but that 1.8% maybe countrywide could be 25% in Windsor, but it could be 0.08% in parts of Alberta. So I think with thinking about the review, we need precision in statements that are overly broad and overly general. Our work on the Section 232 tariff impacts, we've done the only provincial level analysis, makes that distinction quite clear. So I think I don't know that leaving or the end of the North American agreement will wreck the Canadian economy. I'm not willing to say it will or it won't until I have the numbers, until we've gone through these quantification exercises. And the banks are doing it, but I think we need data that doesn't have client-side encumbrances upon it, shall we say. So we need this independent work, and we're doing that now. And as we get the numbers, we'll actually be able to understand what's at risk and who's at risk, and be able to take proactive measures instead of being driven by fear and assumption about what lies ahead.
Carlo, you'll never get me arguing against empirical studies, and I'm really pleased that you're doing that, and I think Calgary is doing a fabulous job, University of Calgary School of Public Policy. What I was really referring to, and I've seen a lot of stuff on this, is the psychology of the capitalist or the owner. If I'm an owner of a business that's doing 5 or 10 million a year, and I lent 9 years, I lent money to SMEs in the Bank of Montreal, millions and millions of dollars. And if I'm sitting here in Eastern Ontario or anywhere near the border, and I'm doing a third of my business going to the States, and the Kuzma disappears, I'm sitting there, and the cost structure is higher in this country, the tax structure is higher in this country, okay, and we have a government that's much more interventionist, and I'm saying, gee whiz, I can just walk across that border, or drive across the border. They'll welcome me with open arms because they're very aggressive towards recruiting capital in these upstate border states. I can go into that country, and my tax rates will go down, my personal tax and my corporate tax, and I have a much bigger market. I'll never have to worry about tariffs again. And the barriers to entry or to going into the States are low, and I think the barriers to staying in Canada are very high. And so, there's businesses that are exiting. We know that capital is moving to the States. I don't have the breakdown of it. I wished I did, but I think we will see. I'm not saying every last business is going to exit to the States, of course not, but there will be some significant capital flight to the States, I'm sure, if we lose Kuzma.
There's already capital flight. It's been happening with
yes.
the agreement, and you will have more businesses. So we're doing the on-the-ground work in Alberta, and what we're seeing is that businesses are moving the necessary production to the U.S. and keeping in Canada. No one wants to uproot their kids. Yes, you can move across the border. Yes, you can have an easier time, but do you want to uproot your life? And we're finding, interestingly, in Alberta, Montana, that dev agencies on both sides are working together. There are also American firms that would love to trade with China or that would love access to the TPP. Not the same number, but we are seeing this arbitration of the difference. But again, on the agreement, look, we are not going to get an agreement. Period. Look at the 17 economies that have negotiated agreements or frameworks with the Americans. Look what happened to the UK. They made concessions. They agreed to take a tariff on pharmaceuticals before the Americans completed their Section 232 investigation to set one. They got an agreement that gave them a baseline tariff and a deal on steel and aluminum. That lasted 2 weeks before the administration came in and changed it. You're going to make concessions, and you have no certainty that the Americans are going to honor the concessions you made. So the idea that we can have a new agreement with the Americans is an illusion. Until we change executive tariff authority, we're not going to have an agreement the way people understand the term. And again, 17 examples of economies that have negotiated. So this isn't subjective thinking. We've got facts and evidence on this.
Well, so, Carlo, you've led me to where I wanted to end on, and that is, should we be looking at trying to find a different agreement? There are some people who just say we should walk away from it. I was speaking with economist Joseph Steinberg from U of T last week. He thinks that both the booze ban, which doesn't apply to your province, doesn't apply to the great province of Saskatchewan, but every other province has an American booze ban. He believes that between that and the way that we have been applying the dairy quotas on the last agreement will lead to Section 301 tariffs under the Trade Act of 1974. And that this is going to happen to us soon if we don't do something. So I'll ask both of you: should we be looking for a new agreement? I am a fan of finding a new agreement. I believe that we are in a position of strength. I don't think we are as weak as most Canadians believe we are. We have a lot to offer. If we go in the right way, I think we can get an agreement, and both countries can move forward. I'd like to hear both of your responses.
I agree with you, Brian. I believe an agreement, a new agreement, is important. I believe that we have advantages. We've all been doom and gloom about we've got nothing on our side to offer, which I just think is preposterous nonsense. The Americans are freaked out, to use a very unacademic term, over China. I read Foreign Policy Journal and Foreign Policy Magazine out of Washington weekly, written by former generals and undersecretaries of state and so forth. They're the elite of the, and they're freaked out by China, especially because they have whatever it is, 90 or 92 or 94% of critical minerals. We have a huge supply. We're not developing them yet, but we can. And there is the basis of a deal there. I mean, I think it was Kissinger who said the role is to find mutual interests, and that's your zone of agreement. There's nations don't have friends, they have interests. And so we do have interests, common interests between the two countries, which is why we've been dealing with each other for 200 years or more. So we just got to identify it, which are not difficult, that zone of agreement, and we're going to have to focus on that and get a new agreement, because I still think we cannot walk away and pretend that the largest economy on planet Earth isn't really there, and that we're going to go off and search for what some partner halfway around the world, such as China or some other country, where we don't speak their language. They're very different culturally from the U.S. and Canada. We have common interests and commonality. We have cross marriage. I mean, we have common harmonization of regulations and so forth. I still believe we should diversify our trade, absolutely, but that does not mean we shouldn't have a deal with the United States or walk away from the U.S.
I mean, China likes to sell us stuff. They don't like to buy our stuff.
Exactly.
I think that okay, either one of you can correct me, but I believe that we sell them about 21 billion a year. This is 2024 numbers, but 21 billion a year we sell them, and they sell us about 65 billion.
It's
So,
wildly imbalanced.
far.
So,
in
again, you've got to get down to the specifics on that. There are industries and wide swaths of the country where the trade is balanced heavily in favor of our exports, and that's out west. So, guys, leave the Laurentian bubble and come out west. The numbers shift.
Come on, Carlo. You know I'm out west a lot.
Yeah, but that statement requires a Western retort. But look, let's back up to the agreement again. We are going to trade with the Americans. That trade will occur with an agreement or without an agreement. The trade can be easy or it can be hard, difficult, and expensive. The Americans are going to make it more difficult. And with the baseline tariff, you go down the 17 countries that have negotiated 10%, 10%, 15%, 10%, 10%. We're more than likely headed for the same. We can survive that. Trade will go across the border. The purpose of negotiating is to try and make trade easier. We do that with the understanding that when we make concessions, we're not making concessions to gain certainty with the Americans, because certainty is not on the table. We're making concessions strategically where we think we have a convergence of interests that will force the Americans to hold through. So it's a complete revision of how we think about this. But one of the problems we have is that the illusion of certainty with an agreement exists. Look, we have the only legally binding agreement with the U.S. The 17 agreements I referenced are executive orders. We have a binding agreement that was ratified by Congress. In that agreement, we have protections from 232 tariffs. That agreement yielded us no benefit whatsoever. The Americans ignored what they agreed to. But other elements of the agreement have held. Other elements of the agreement do facilitate trade. So again, specifics matter. So when you think about an agreement, it's not, okay, we signed, we're done, that nightmare's over, we can get on with our lives. Every dollar that we invest in trade diversification to foreign markets going forward has to be matched by a dollar in keeping exports that we have to the U.S. Intelligence gathering, advocacy. This is not going to end with Trump. It won't end with the shift to the progressives in the states. It may get worse. So we've got to get back. We're still living in the freaking 1970s and 80s when we think about the U.S. Yes, we need an agreement, but we have to understand what that word agreement means. It doesn't mean when Reagan and Mulrooney were talking. It means something different.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I love that you summed it up that way, Carlo. I keep trying to point out to people the protectionism that we're seeing now out of the White House really started under Obama, got worse under Trump the first, worse under Biden, and is worse again under Trump the second. And I don't expect that it will be any different regardless of who takes over after Trump's second term.
God help us if Bernie Sanders comes in. You thought Trump was bad.
We'll all just wear parkas and mittens and say, I'm waiting to help you. All right, gents, thank you very much for your time. I've taken up too much of it, but appreciate you both being here.
Thank you very much.
Brian.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name is Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Please remember to hit subscribe, leave a comment, share this on social media, and help spread the word. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.
There were so many missed opportunities to catch this before the devastating thing happened.
A third of them we found literally in the phone book. These people were not afraid. They knew that nobody was effectively hunting them. They knew they had escaped justice, that they were going to die in their beds.
When I give talks at law schools, is that the charter ultimately is empowering a minority, and it's empowering a minority that's a guild across the country. And it's a fairly elite guild, and the guild is lawyers.
Families who were split by referendum, and brothers and sisters who never talked to each other for years after the referendum because they were so angry at each other because of emotions on both sides.
The reason he was assassinated was not because he was trying to put a satellite into space, but because the gun that he was creating had other applications that made him and the gun very dangerous.
It's finally here. A new season of Canada Did What? Host media podcast that revisits the big Canadian political events you might think you remember and tells you the real story you never knew. I'm Tristan Hopper. The voices you just heard are from our brand new Season 2. We will unpack some of the pivotal moments that helped define our country, often without a vote, usually without a plan, and sometimes without anyone admitting what they'd done. We'll find out how Canada became a welcoming paradise for untold numbers of Nazi war criminals after the Second World War. We let them build monuments to their wartime exploits and even ended up honoring a Nazi fighter in the House of Commons. And I'm sorry to say that none of that happened by accident. We'll bring you the little-known story of a troubled Canadian rocket scientist who turned to a sinister life of selling giant guns to terrible people. And if that sounds like a spy novel, it ends like one too. You'll hear the behind-the-scenes story of Quebec's attempted secession from Canada and how very close we came to a political crisis that would have made Brexit look like a picnic. You'll hear about how the much-celebrated Charter of Rights and Freedoms turned into something its creators never wanted, and how many of the most extravagant warnings about the document were all quickly proven true. And you'll even hear about how authorities bungled multiple chances to stop the deadliest terrorist attack in our country's history and then proceeded to pretend it never happened. These aren't dusty history lessons. They're stories about power, ambition, madness, and the things about Canada that a lot of people would rather ignore. But not you. You won't want to miss an episode. Subscribe to make sure you get all of Season 2 starting March 2026 anywhere you get your podcasts.